If you look at this sort of macro political level, you might think everybody's at each other's throats. But then if you look in these little corners of creativity on social media, what I was seeing back in 2016, when Oscillations was first starting to become an idea, was people connecting all around the world and sharing and pursuing beauty and knowledge together. And I want to see more of that and less of the kind of acrimony and divisiveness. I think the former bodes a much brighter future than the latter. And so how can we do that with art? How can we do that with community building? How can we do it with venture capital?
Hello, my name is Wing, and thanks for listening to A Work in Purpose. Do you see people who are living their purpose and wondering, how did they get there? Are you wondering, what is your purpose too? Me too. That is why I am inviting you to join me on this journey. A Work in Purpose is our podcast for igniting and reaching our purpose together. Be sure to subscribe. Each week, I'll be sharing a podcast episode of me interviewing people from all walks of life who are working towards some kind of purpose, whether it is with their career, volunteering, creativity, spiritual practices, or just how they approach everyday life. We'll dive deep into their stories to uncover what obstacles they had to overcome to reach their purpose today. By hearing their stories, I hope you will learn from their journey and be inspired so you too can become a work in purpose. Can you envision, with all of the new emerging technologies, what will art be like 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now? On this episode of A Work in Purpose, our guest Brendon Lewis is the founder of Oscillations Art, and he is on a mission to shape the future of art, similar to what Walt Disney did in the 1900s. Through Oscillations, Brendon is laying the foundations for new possibilities of art using emerging technologies. As a former acrobatic performer, he has brought together performance artists, technologists, and venture capitalists to bring stunning virtual reality art experiences to life. His hope is that art should once again elevate people and bring them together in pursuit of community, beauty, and knowledge. But as new technologies like VR headsets fizzle out a bit, turning his vision into reality had not been an easy ride. Listen to this fascinating episode to hear how Brendon first discovered his purpose, how he managed to persevere and stay devoted to his purpose despite many setbacks, and his inspiring vision for the future of human society, technology, and art. Hello, Brendon Lewis. Thank you for being a part of A Work in Purpose podcast. So I want to ask you first, you're doing something really interesting that combines art, technology, and neuroscience called Oscillation Art. Can you explain what it is?
Oh, gosh, it's a complex endeavor. And I think maybe one of the things we are worst at is an elevator pitch. But let me give that a shot. On the creative side of things, you could think of us as a modern arts company. I say arts as opposed to performing arts, although we certainly do a lot of performance, but I say arts more generally because we are inspired by the ideas of the Ballet Russe at the turn of the last century in the early 1900s. That was a famous ballet company that was known for total art, or Gesamtkunstwerk is the German word used in art criticism. And Gesamtkunstwerk is this idea that you're bringing together a lot of different artists from different mediums to collaborate, and the sum is greater than the parts. So in the case of the Ballet Russe, you had painters designing big sets and curtains. You had Pablo Picasso working on sets and costumes alongside applied arts artists from Russia and fashion designers like Coco Chanel. You had composers like Igor Stravinsky and Francis Poulenc and Eric Satie and Prokofiev working on scores for this kind of avant-garde choreography that would become dance modernism and contemporary ballet, created by boy genius Nijinsky and Michel Fokine, Leonid Messine, and then eventually George Balanchine towards the end of the life of the company. So the Ballet Russe touched every component of art and culture during the kind of end of the Belle Epoque in Paris. They had this huge and outsized impact on culture. And it's just that sort of collaboration that we want to capture at the dawn of the 21st century, understanding that there are a lot of similarities between, the second industrial revolution and globalization, where new cultures were kind of intersecting for the first time. People were traveling on ocean liners and railroads for the first time. There were all kinds of new technologies coming out that were blowing people's minds, like the radio and film and television. And television came a little bit later, but you certainly had film at that point. You had electricity. And so it was really this kind of pivotal moment in culture across the world. And the Ballet Russe kind of captured with its art that sense of dynamicism and change. And there were a famous writers and critics in England called the Bloomsbury Group that included Virginia Woolf and John Maynard Keynes. And the Bloomsbury loved the Ballet Russe, and they said of the Ballet Russe, it boded a hope for the future. The company's art kind of gave them hope and inspiration that humans would be able to get it together and build a more beautiful world where people were able to pursue art and beauty. That was sort of the founder's stone of Keynesian economics, actually, was that he believed economics was a tool that people could use to build a society that was more prosperous so that humans could continue to pursue beauty and knowledge. And I think that there should be companies like the Ballet Russe existing today to carry that torch, carry the idea into the 21st century that humans could get it together if we really tried, and we could build a more prosperous world. To be a little bit Silicon Valley geek here, we could build that Starfleet, that beautiful space traveling exploratory culture of the future that sort of transcends the human problems of dividedness and scarcity. And so I like the idea that companies pursuing total art could kind of carry a sort of civic duty and bode a more beautiful future, reflect that in its creation.
And how does Oscillation Art try to accomplish that?
Well, there's a few things. We're fairly new into this adventure. We're just a couple of years old. We're coming off a project that we did with Facebook and moving into one that we've been working on, workshopping conceptually with Google and some phenomenal artists from around the world. So we're sort of transitioning from one project to the next, and that will be our second ever. They're big. They take a lot of time to prepare. It takes a lot of money. So they're very ambitious in scope. But to answer your question, we believe that we have to be positioned at the intersection of academia, the university system around the world, the university network, where people are, paid to think and think as hard as they can, as well as they can, about everything we're thinking about. And then, of course, at the intersection of academia and big technology. So we've built a network at companies like Facebook and Google, Intel and Hewlett Packard, and companies that are working on technologies that the average person may not even be aware are coming down the pipeline, or they're right around the corner. And some of them are already here. And then, of course, we want to be at the intersection of the university system, big technology, and art and culture. So we have an advisor. He's a neuroscientist at Northwestern named Moran Cerf. And he often speaks about feeling a sense of responsibility as a scientist to always be putting 10 to 20% of his time working with artists to communicate these really complicated ideas to the public in a way that we can understand and digest, and that sort of integrates into the broader kind of ethos of society and of globalized civilization. And so we want to have conversations at that intersection. We want to also make sure that artists have a seat at that table. There are new technologies being developed for creation, for creativity, like brain-computer interfaces. That's where you control computers with your mind. Virtual and augmented reality, where you, in the case of virtual reality, you're going into a headset and you're going into vast worlds that people can create. With augmented reality, you're creating a layer on top of the world that we see around us. And there are sort of gradations along that spectrum. There's varying degrees of immersion. So think about what happens when those two technologies collide. When you have brain-computer interfaces and virtual and augmented reality, you're going to start to be able to project your thoughts and your imagination onto these virtual worlds or onto the world that we see, and the sort of added layers that we impose on those worlds via augmented reality. There are other technologies that are a little bit earlier on still than brain-computer interfaces, like image reconstruction and artificial intelligence. So image reconstruction, we're starting to be able to record, to render photo and video from people's dreams, from their thoughts. So it sounds really crazy, it's really bizarre stuff, but it is happening with specifically, I think, in academic labs at the university systems. Our advisor to the company is working on this, and we're able to take patients who have implants because they might have like epilepsy, say, and so they have implants to control their seizures. But that also allows us to record their brain electricity, the electrical signals that their brain is creating, and decipher that and start to render photo and video from what they're dreaming. So when you start to think about what artificial intelligence and machine learning could do to increase the speed and efficiency and accuracy with which we process that information, and then you combine that with brain-computer interfaces and virtual reality, we are going to be able to someday soon, in the next maybe 3 or 4 decades, we're going to be able to go into virtual and augmented realities and just think whatever we want to exist, and it will appear before our eyes. That future can either be terrifying or it can be beautiful. And at Oscillations, we think that if artists have a seat at the table in the very early days of these conversations and the way that these technologies develop, and who owns the intellectual property rights to these technologies, how they are entrusted to future generations, then we have a better shot at doing it responsibly. And so there's a component to Oscillations in which we are packaged as a startup that one could invest in. We are artists and scientists, and we learned to speak the language of entrepreneurs. It's what brought us out to the Bay Area. We have raised some investment capital, and we are continuing to do so to kind of tackle these large ambitions that we have. But there's a strong business component to what we're doing as well. And so we have to walk this line between, being an arts company and thinking about how we are an investable idea to people who want to build a better world, but also be compensated for taking risks, especially with an idea as unique as Oscillations.
I have a quick question about that dream imagery thingy. So right now, we can see pictures or like actual image of what people are dreaming of, or just like, I don't know, colors, or what? How does it look?
It's a little bit rough. I think, if someone was dreaming about their grandmother, we might be able to get something that looks like an impressionist painting of their grandmother. A very, think the blurriest Monet that comes to mind, or something kind of pointillism-ish. So we're not rendering grandma quite yet, but we're getting some sort of impression of grandma. And that's, if you think about how quickly machine learning is developing to kind of render photo and video just from, searching Google, searching the cloud for, I believe the technology already exists that you can have machines scan Google and pull every red door off image search that it can find and kind of give you a composite of what it thinks you might be thinking when you ask it to find a red door. So all that's left to do is kind of connect that technology to brain-computer interface, to virtual and augmented reality, and we start to be able to go into immersive realities and think what we want to see.
Wow, very cool. So from your description of Oscillation Arts, your mission for that is to get technologists and artists together to collaborate on whatever will come out of it. And some of your more recent projects were VR experience, immersive performance arts experience. So
Yes.
can you talk more about that and how you plan to use that as like the segue to the next phase of what you guys are doing?
Mhm. Yeah. So there's two ways to answer that question, or there's at least two ways that come to mind right now. I'll first answer maybe in the more lofty kind of abstract artist sense, but there's also a business sense in which I can answer that question, because it does kind of get into, well, how are you going to build this thing? How does it actually work? So artistically, it's a fun space to be in because these technologies are new and there's not a lot of precedent yet. And so it's kind of an artist's playland in that sense, because the goal is really to be exploratory right now. I imagine, a lot of people in virtual and augmented reality, they talk about the industry as being what it must have been like when film first started, and there was a first time that somebody decided to shoot a camera from the ground looking up, so we're at that stage with the technology where everybody's kind of having these revelations, and we're inventing things as we go along and inventing ways of doing things, trying new things. Not everything works out, but it's a great place to be creative. And it's actually a great place to invite artists in. If I had one big complaint about the industry right now, there's a lot of engineers. There are some artists out there kind of subsisting off very, very small grants, but nothing like what would be required to really develop, especially virtual reality, as an industry that would evolve like the film industry has over the last 100 plus years. So I'd love to see artists enabled to do that with more capital to do that. And the reason that's not happening, that's actually a good segue into the business side of things. And then I can kind of get into how Oscillations sees itself fitting into both the creative and the business side. The reason why there isn't a lot of money and energy going into creation in this space in a big way, and it's expensive to make. It's the cost of film production has come down. The cost of cinematic virtual reality or game design in virtual reality or augmented reality, that's quite expensive because it's new and there aren't that many people who are expert at it. So if you want it to come out well, there's a small pool of talent to pull from. So everything is quite costly. The reason there aren't funds going into that space, or there hasn't been really since 2016, 2017, is because it's sort of trapped in the venture capital hype cycle. And what investors would be looking for from content creators, I guess you would call it in the business sense, would be obviously revenue. And revenue is hard to do when there are only maybe 10 to 20 million headsets in circulation. So the reason why you can invest a lot of money into television is because you have a customer pipeline that's available to most people around the world. And you can sell your content just about anywhere. With virtual and augmented reality, you have maybe 8 to 10 million people, and only a small portion of those people are going to be interested in whatever kind of self-indulgent art project you might want to create. And so there's a hardware problem, or what investors and entrepreneurs would call an install base. That's people who have the technology and who have installed the applications and who are able to kind of receive your content. And I guess this is a classic chicken or the egg problem. When a new technology or a new platform comes out, what comes first, the users or the content? Users want content when they show up to a new platform, but investors don't want to create content or put up the money to create content unless the users are already there. So how do you solve that problem? And that's something that Oscillations thinks about and obsesses over on the business side of what we do. And so moving forward, our goal is to kind of build a brand presence outside of immersive realities and outside of the immersive space. That's traditional 2D content, social content. We also have a podcast. And so getting the word out there and building a kind of consumer base or fan base, whatever you want to call it, that's important because we want to sort of build that relationship and build that presence and then escort them and introduce them to new places, build bridges between where people are consuming content now and where they will be consuming content in the future. We believe the best way to do that is to tell authentic stories, things that, we don't really want to kind of deign to make whatever is popular on YouTube or TikTok. We have a sort of ethic, and it might be shooting ourselves in the foot, but we don't want to, I suppose, what's called frack for attention. We don't want to do these kind of gimmicky things that are really successful on social media just in order to get 1 or 2 seconds more out of people's precious and dwindling attention. So something we think about a lot is, how is social media changing? How is technology impacting our lives? And in no small way, in building a sort of media brand, we are going to have to confront the ethics of social media. And that's a really hot topic right now. And I don't think the dust has settled. And it's something that we think a lot about. And there are newly emerging leaders in this space kind of rethinking first principles about content creation and social media, and how can we do this in a way that encourages people to be aspirational, to dream big, rather than to just kind of fritter away hours of our time scrolling through these kind of little gimmicky dances and, trolling and, pardon my French, you can edit this out if you want, but shit posting. How do we sort of steer people towards kind of ethics and values around spending our time wisely and voting for what we want to see in the world with our attention?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw that you wrote about how you want to have an impact on humans by optimizing content for better human beings. Can you talk more about how that looks like? Can you expand on that?
That's a good question. I do think about that a lot. I might not have a satisfying answer for you yet, but I've been thinking about it, especially over the last few months. I heard this great Ezra Klein interview, I think just before he moved from Vox to the New York Times. He interviewed the author, I believe it's Zachary Carter, and he just wrote a book that is it's sort of like a biography of John Maynard Keynes, the economist. I keyed into this interview because I'm a political science student. That was my undergraduate degree. And so, of course, I'd heard of this, Keynes. He's a leader in economics thinking. He's had a big impact on the discipline of economics. But also he married a dancer from the Ballet Russe. And he intersected with the Ballet Russe, which is one of my favorite things in art history. And his economics, as I mentioned earlier, was focused on how to build a better world and a better society. In this podcast with Ezra Klein, the author talks with Ezra about Keynes' value for, how do we use economics to create a society where people, enjoy more beauty and knowledge. And, like I used Starfleet as an example earlier, the Star Trek example of where people are exploring by day and learning about the universe and their place in the universe by day. And then they retire to their rooms at night to study music or reenact, classic literature in the holodeck. And that, I think, right now in society would maybe even be called elitist. And so something I've been grappling with, and I don't really have an answer quite yet. When I do, it'll be up on the blog for sure. But how do we strike that balance between encouraging an aspirational culture and avoiding this kind of elitism? So what is popular or in vogue right now in economic thinking, even among the Keynesians like Paul Krugman, I think is to shy away from making value judgments about anything at all. This is more like the Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman kind of sort of libertarian or neo-Austrian economic thinking, which doesn't make any value judgments at all. It considers the free market as, I think this is a Milton Friedman quote, the sum total of economic activity, the free market, is the purest expression of the democratic will. And what he what he's saying there, what I think the neo-Austrians or the free market economists are arguing is a hard thing to dispute. It's a hard thing to grapple with, which is this idea that no group of curators, no governmental organization could presume to know better for people what the sum total of human economic activity could say about people's wants and desires. In other words, who are you to say that you know what's, beautiful or better for society, or what should be considered knowledge? And that's a good point, especially from a social justice perspective. We definitely, if there is a small group of curators deciding what is culture, what is knowledge, what is beauty, there are going to be voices who are left out that maybe we don't want to be left out. But on the other hand, and I worry about this a lot, perhaps more so because it's just sort of the dominant paradigm right now. If we default to sort of this free market, then we have a regression to the mean. We have, we've got sort of little attention grabbing little TikTok dances, and we have, YouTube call out culture, argumentative stuff, or worse, you have kind of these darker corners of social media and YouTube and all the hate and all the acrimony and the divisiveness, which I don't think it's an understatement to say that too much of that is a recipe for the unraveling of civilization entirely. And so how do we strike that balance between kind of having an aspirational culture and having some sort of curatorial element where we are comfortable making value judgments about better and worse ways to spend our time and energy, and avoiding a sort of dystopian control over people's passions and pursuits? I don't have the answer, but I suspect Oscillations is somewhere in the middle. And it might be fair to accuse us of elitism from time to time. That might be an avoidable consequence of being in the arts. You have to be sort of, I guess, fairly proud of yourself to presume that you can create something new in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. So that's, I guess, the cons of democracy, where everyone gets to vote for what they like. And then if they vote for something that is bad for you, like McDonald's, then what can you do, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, diving more into that. So you wrote about how we are now living in the post-everything society, where the institutions, the ideals that we all used to believe in turn out to be illusions over the last decades, particularly with politics, technology, and the pandemic have kind of proved that too. Can you tell us more about why you think oscillation arts is important in a place in time right now, given that?
Sure. I guess this comes down to meaning. This is something that my co-founder and I talk a lot about. And she's a cognitive scientist, a neuroscientist, works in artificial intelligence, thinks about the brain. Her PhD was in developmental. So she thinks a lot about how humans learn, acquire language, develop a mind and a persona. And so we talk a lot about what does meaning mean? And like I said in the answer to your last question, we seem to kind of shy away from it right now in culture. We don't want to make any value judgments, so we don't at all. And I think when you do that, you don't really have a meaning, or meaning becomes so personal and individualized that it can't exist at a societal level or a civilizational level. And so I get the sense that maybe somewhere in our subconscious, or maybe our consciousness, our conscious awareness, humanity is experiencing a sort of adriftness. Like, we're facing some profound existential crises like climate change. The technologies coming down the pipeline, like artificial intelligence, actually pose like an existential threat. Even brain-computer interfaces, which is a technology we are interested in working with creatively, has some major social justice implications down the road if people can afford to get brain-computer interface implants in the brain and suddenly have this cognitive revolution that leaves behind a whole group of people who cannot afford to have brain-computer interfaces. You're looking at something approaching speciation. That's a social justice problem right there. That's important to think about now as these technologies are in their early stages. So we're facing these big existential threats, and we are afraid to make any steps towards an aspirational culture, some sort of values that we can all share in and work on together. And so the point of Total Art and bringing artists together from all over the world to work alongside scientists and creative technologists and entrepreneurs and investors, the idea there is in some ways to showcase that that is possible. So art that showcases cross-cultural collaboration and creative ideas from all over the world is just an example of something that I think we need more of. You know, it's funny what happens when you look at social media, especially in the arts. And this kind of gets into how did Oscillations as an idea come about? How was it born? I was a circus performer in my past life. And when social media first started around Instagram and YouTube and stuff, I was watching my colleagues from all over the world get connected and start sharing videos and ideas. I was watching information travel across the world at the speed of technology, at the speed of the internet. And these global conversations were happening around creativity and artistic expression. And I thought that was really beautiful. And when you look at that, you see a totally different world than when you turn on the news and you listen to, you know, Russia is hacking the United States, and, you know, this country is arguing with this one about trade negotiations. If you look at this sort of macro political level, you might think everybody's at each other's throats. But then if you look in these little corners of creativity on social media, what I was seeing back in 2016, when Oscillations was first starting to become an idea, was people connecting all around the world and sharing and pursuing beauty and knowledge together. And I want to see more of that and less of the kind of acrimony and divisiveness. I think the former bodes a much brighter future than the latter. And so how can we do that with art? How can we do that with community building? How can we do it with venture capital? Venture capital is super guilty of like pumping lots of dumb money into vaporware, or worse, kind of pyramid scheme, disruptive ideas that actually just make things worse. How can venture capital do better? For all its lofty rhetoric about investing in a better future, I don't actually see a lot of it. So what sorts of new ideas can simultaneously build creative communities and cross-cultural collaboration and innovation and ethical development of new scary technologies? How can investors do better? Those are some things we're trying to do at Oscillations as well. Did I answer your question? I kind of just went on a rant.
No, that was great. Thank you. So I'm very curious, how did you discover this really cool purpose of what you're doing now? So you were always in the creative world, right? You were acrobat, and like, how did you transition from that to what you were doing today?
Yeah, well, both my parents were ballet dancers professionally. And so I guess the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. I went to school for political science. That's where all the sort of ideology and economic stuff sort of seeps into the way that we talk about Oscillations. But when I was a kid, I grew up, my bedtime stories were stories about the ballet groups. And so I'd always known about this sort of magical company that did all these incredible things at the turn of the last century. I sort of fleshed out that mystical knowledge or mythical knowledge with, you know, facts and history as I got older. But that seed was planted very early on by my parents. And then so I graduated with a degree in political science in 2008, for better or worse. That was not a great time to graduate from college because it was the peak of the economic crisis. And I was having trouble shopping around my newly minted degree from Arizona State University. And so I ended up falling into the circus community. I had made some friends in that community. It provided a kind of a safe place to land. Circus also becomes an obsession. You have to really be kind of a machine and a glutton for punishment, I suppose. I think there's an old Russian expression, maybe, if an acrobat wakes up and he's not sore and tired and in pain, he's probably dead. So it takes a certain kind of obsessive personality to excel. And that obsession, I suppose, was a great counterbalance to the stress of graduating college and having your whole life in front of you during an economic crisis and coming off war in the Middle East. And, we had our own sort of feelings of existential angst back in 2008. So Circus was a great place for me to land. I developed my network in that community. And then by 2016, like I was saying in my answer to your last question, I was watching these communities grow on social media platforms like Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. And like I said, I found that incredibly beautiful. And I found that to be, from a business perspective, one of the most underutilized assets in the marketing world. So thinking sort of like the Ballet Russe would have at the intersection of public relations, the company's director, Sergei Diaghilev, was a master of public relations. They wouldn't have been able to have the impact that they had without it. So they had a keen eye for marketing. They had a keen eye for sort of culture making. And so if you were to take a network of, say, 150 plus creators from around the world working in what marketers call passion verticals. That's sports, dance, fashion, makeup. There are creative communities around everything. There are people making puppets out there that blow anything Hollywood's ever done out of the water. There are people doing sort of special effects makeup, digital art, you name it. There's a community for it on the internet. And there are these people with audiences in the hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions, who are beneath the surface of mainstream celebrity and mainstream awareness, but they have these communities of loyal followers who are very interested in what they're doing. And we took a look under the hood at some of the creators who are working with the Oscillations project, and the engagement metrics on their audiences are platform leading. So these sort of macro to micro influencers on social media, their audiences are a special kind of audience. It has above average engagement. And so I'm thinking, man, if you pool them all together, you're going well beyond 6-figure, 7-figure, even 8-figure audiences. You pool them all together and you have a huge global network of highly engaged people interested in, and it's sort of a pre-validated audience because you know that they're interested in these themes of art and creativity. And the hypothesis at Oscillations is that they're curious to see what's next. What would happen if these creators they love so much started working together regularly on projects, especially projects with amazing new technologies like the kind that Google and Facebook are developing. And from a marketing perspective, what you get is a built-in audience. That's something virtual reality technology doesn't really have. And they're not doing a very good job at getting people to care and to buy headsets. And so you can get this kind of total art company making super cool stuff, but there's also a marketing avenue there to maybe sell, to help sell headsets, to help sell new technologies. And that's something the industry hasn't been able to do yet. So that's something we think about more, as a business and from an investor's perspective. But more broadly speaking, relative to our goals and our values, if you can build that kind of platform as a brand or as a company, as a cultural mainstay, then you and your network of artists and academics around the world, you have an ability to maybe help steer the course of how these technologies develop in a responsible and ethical way. Because otherwise they're going to be, these sort of trashy landscapes riddled with ads, just like what social media has become, or worse, or it's going to be some data breaching dystopian nightmare that brings to mind, like the Cambridge Analytica scandals and just the sort of creepy big brother way that we are afraid social media is abusing our data. So we might not be able to get ahead of social media and steer that in an ethical direction, although there are some initiatives that are trying, like Vero, but we can definitely get ahead of brain-computer interfaces and brain-computer interfaced virtual and augmented reality before it's just turned into another data privacy trash heap full of ads and privacy issues.
Yeah, so I'm curious to learn more. So you were an acrobat for many years, and then you saw these videos that really inspired you, but many people watch videos and get inspired, but then they don't really do anything, right? So what was going on inside yourself that sparked the light inside of you to actually do something about it? And what was happening in your life?
To be somewhat pithy or cute about it, I suppose. I could say an acrobat is particularly well positioned to be an entrepreneur because we learn to tolerate pain all day. So there's that, but it is very true. Your body and your brain and your personality just get used to pain. So I knew that I could probably withstand the sort of rigors and demands and rejections of being an entrepreneur. It takes a particular kind of nutcase to launch a business, much less something as weird and complicated and new as Oscillations. It'd be one thing if we had a sort of Uber for dogs idea that is easy to understand and, gets all the business school sweater vest clad venture capitalists all, in a tizzy, but that's not the kind of idea that we are. So we have to work much harder, I think, than the average startup. So, pain tolerance is one, and, to be a little pithy about it. But the other thing I would say, and this is super deep. I don't know how deep you want to go here, but Oscillations is guided by modern understanding and principles from neuroscience and cognitive science, which have a very different idea of what it means to have a self and to have a consciousness than I think we use in our sort of natural, intuitive, colloquial, or folk language, I think scientists might call it. So humans have this intuition of what it means to have a self and what it means to be conscious. The way that academics talk about it is very different. And you might even say, kind of a little bit counterintuitively, we don't have a self and we're not conscious in the way that we think we are. So I don't want to get too much into that. There's tons of great literature on that. We will hopefully be having a lot of these thinkers on our podcast and writing about this on our blog and things like that, because it's so important to what we do. But to make it relevant here to your question, I would say neither founder at Oscillations has much of a need for a self outside of a project. We don't think too much about what we personally want out of life. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about self-care. It kind of goes to that pain tolerance thing a little bit, but we're so much more motivated by ideas. In some sense, we think about the human experience and the human mind as a vehicle for whatever ideas take a hold of it. And what we aspire to be as people is a good vehicle for an idea. And so Oscillations took a hold of us. And to use maybe the language of the ancient Greeks, it's our muse, and we feel that the best way we could spend our life, our time on earth, is to be a good vehicle, to be a good servant of the muses. And like I said earlier, I feel particularly well disposed to do it because I have a high pain tolerance. But also, I just don't think a lot about myself. I don't have a lot of personal goals outside of this broader project to make the world a better place.
I see. So it sounds like you had some sort of conscious awakening and you kind of shed your egoic self at some point, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I can't think of a catalyzing event. I've probably been reading books about the science of consciousness and identity for maybe 15, 20 years now, just sort of out of curiosity. And then my co-founder happens to be a cognitive scientist, and so we're having those conversations all the time. So there might have been this kind of gradual dissolution of sort of a modern selfhood, maybe. And it's interesting because we approach it sort of as empiricists, as analytic philosophers and more sort of scientifically minded folks. But there's a lot of overlap between that and these kind of like East Asian metaphysical ideas that come out of Taoism, I think is maybe the tradition I'm most familiar with, at least in a sort of westernized Alan Watts kind of sense. But I'm aware that the concepts of self in Eastern metaphysics are a little bit different than the Western ones, and sort of these intuitions that we have growing up in the West. And so I have a passing interest in that, and I have some of that philosophy on my bookshelf. I do think it's interesting. I do think these ideas about self are older than this kind of modern cognitive science vantage. So I feel like it's sort of a proud old tradition. But yeah, I would say maybe a gradual process is sort of like, what is it? Putting a frog in water and then slowly turning up the heat. I probably didn't notice it happening, but for whatever reason, I don't resonate with language about like what I'm entitled to or what I want out of life. It's much more of an outward orientation. So the kinds of quotes that really resonate with me are sort of like the JFK, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. My favorite quote in the world is, I believe it's George Bernard Shaw, and it's called "A Splendid Torch" is the name of this quote. And it's a long quote, and I can't quote it from memory, but the gist of it is, I don't want to spend my life kind of being this little ball of grievances and ailments, complaining that the world won't make me happy. I think that life is this brief flame, this brief candle, and I want to grab a hold of it, and I want to give everything I have to my community to make it better. I want to like burn out. I want to burn the candles at both ends. I want to be this I want to go out in this big explosion where I spend all my energy, sort of like a star, I'm terrible at astrophysics, but like a dwarf, one of the white dwarf, red dwarf, whatever it is, that, these stars just burn so hot that they burn themselves out. That's how I want to live my life, just completely in service of making the world better and serving an idea.
Great. So when you first started thinking about this idea for Oscillations and made your first few steps towards making it into a reality, what were those first few steps like? And did you have any early wins that kind of propelled you forward, or did you have some setbacks that made you question everything? And how did you get past beyond that stage and move forward?
Oh, sure. Yeah. When we first started, we were building a network very easily, both in the entrepreneurial sense. This was like 2017. So we were still kind of trailing off the vapors of the venture capital hype cycle that was kicked off when Facebook bought Oculus, the virtual reality company. So every time something like that happens in Silicon Valley, investors get really excited. And, venture capital just sort of chases hypey trends and fads. And that's just how it works. They're called hype cycles. And so Facebook buys a virtual reality company, and all of a sudden people see dollar signs. It's a gold rush. And that happened for VR in like 2015, 2016. So there was still some money going around by 2017. People were still kind of excited about it. And so we entered that community during that sort of excitement. And we had success in bringing this idea to my network of creators from my time spent in the circus arts and dance. And everybody was really excited about it and on board. So we had everyone sign contracts or memorandums of understanding or letters of interest or intent. And so we got about 150 of them eventually under agreements. And that was enough to attract venture capital. So we raised angel investment. We were in Chicago at the time where my co-founder was getting her PhD. And we integrated into the Chicago entrepreneurial network. We were very new, I think, what is it? The expression wet behind the ears or green or something. But yeah, we were just little babies. I was coming off a career in performing arts, and my co-founder was a scientist. We didn't have a business bone in our bodies between the two of us. So my co-founder, being in a PhD program, she was able to take classes at the business school at Northwestern. So there was some bootstrapping there. And the business class was great. It was entrepreneurism for like creatives and entertainment. And it was the most realistic class ever. The professor said, here's a network of 30 people I know from my career. Go out and network. They're expecting to hear from you. And that was the class. Like, there was pedagogy, of course, but the most realistic thing that you can do for aspiring entrepreneurs is extend to them your network and say, go out and, let people pick apart your idea. Let them, tear your idea to shreds. You'll hear a lot of no's. You'll hear a lot of, I don't get this. You'll hear a lot of like, you're crazy. And that's really good early on. It helps you really tighten things up. there's a presentation you give to investors called a slide deck. It's, 10 or so slides that sort of tell the story of your company in a particular format that investors like to read ideas in. And God, we must have made like 60 decks over the course of 3 years as we got feedback from different people in the network we were building. So talk about moments where, so we raised angel. We were feeling really good. Things were going well. We were building a great network. We raised some angel investment. We struck up a partnership with Universal Music Group. And between the creators and the angel capital and using our network to kind of create these partnerships, that was enough to be invited to a Facebook accelerator program where they help develop developers for virtual reality. And that's under the aegis of Oculus, which is the VR company they bought in 2015, 2016. And we did that program. And at the end of the program, they awarded 4 grants, and we were one of the 4 recipients. And that was enough to finish this project that we had made with Universal. And that art piece was called Fire Together. We did it with 30 of the 150 artists that we had under some kind of agreement or statement of interest. And that was the first thing we did. A lot of bootstrapping. We were super duper proud of it. And just as we're kind of wrapping up that project, the VR industry is tanking. This is what happens in venture hype cycles. People are super into it. And if it doesn't explode in a couple of years, they just drop it. They just move on. The Silicon Valley in general, I think, even at startups within big companies like Google, if it doesn't take off in a year and a half, it's toast. There's no patience or attention span in big tech. So we had just finished this thing, the world's great, and the VR industry is just bottoming out. People are jumping ship left and right. Google shutters Daydream, and Intel closes its big volumetric studio in LA. All the big players who were there just a year or two before, who had raised tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions. In the case of Magic Leap, billions and billions of dollars, were all kind of going, they were closing. Jaunt was one of the early cinematic virtual reality companies, was selling off its computers. We're talking yard sale kind of end of the venture cycle for virtual reality. So the conversations that we would have when networking, venture investment was just we don't do VR anymore. And the people who were working in the industry, the conversations were more like pity parties. We would get together for meetings where we talk about what we were working on, but really it was more like commiseration. And it was bleak. It's still kind of that way. So the hype cycle has this peak, and then it has a trough, and then they have this, sort of inflated venture capital language for it. They call it the slope of enlightenment. And that's where you come out of the trough of disillusionment. It's all very silly language, but I'd say we're maybe at the kind of going up the slope of enlightenment now. There's maybe a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, but it's still kind of bleak. And that's just because there hasn't been a lot of headset sales. So Apple just recently started hiring like crazy in VR. That might be the great hope for the industry, because if anyone can drive hardware sales, it's not going to be Google or Facebook. They're not very good at hardware. If you look at their track record for hardware, it kind of stinks. Apple, on the other hand, that's what they do. They sell expensive hardware, and they do it really well. So maybe we're coming out on the other end of something. And on the brighter side of the entrepreneurial industry, venture capital, like I said, they think in terms of buzzy, hypey trends. And one trend right now is the creator economy. So you'll start to hear a lot of investors and entrepreneurs talking about the passion economy, the creator economy. This is around things like Substack and Clubhouse and hype houses for TikTok stars and things like that. So there's a lot of buzz around what happens when creators flex their attention economics. They flex their might and their power, or they pool their resources, and they launch new brands and new media enterprises. That stuff's doing really well. In fact, even celebrities are learning the value of social media. You see Will Smith's company, Westbrook, does a lot on social media to build up Will's brand. And it's worth every dollar because he can command, $2 million to do a single Instagram post to promote Aladdin or something. And that's because he's built up his brand on social media. So all of a sudden, back in 2017, we're talking about influencers and creators. Nobody knows what we're talking about. Deer in the headlights. Now, all of a sudden, we can kind of take shortcuts. Everybody speaks our jargon. It's a little bittersweet to have kind of seen that coming because I was immersed in it. I saw my colleagues in dance and sport build these big audiences and grow up, but it took 3 or 4 years for the business world to kind of catch up and see the value there. So I would say we've had our ups and downs. And personally, I think my co-founder and I did not know anxiety or depression in the way that people seem to talk about it until we took on this big entrepreneurial endeavor and we saw the industry sort of bottom out and wonder, like, if we had just gone all in and staked everything we had, our hopes and dreams, our identity, our personal finances, everything went into this project. We were wondering, God, are we crazy? Is this a failure? That's a pretty dark place to go. And I think what pulled us through is really that lack of self, the lack of sense of entitlement, the idea that I would rather spend my life enduring pain and giving everything I have for a good idea than, spending my life pursuing some career so that I can have some basic level of comfort and I can compete with my neighbor as to who has the better car or the bigger guest bedroom or whatever. None of that really appeals to anyone working on the Oscillations project. So we were able to kind of pull through, and we continue to press on the success and the launch of this idea every single day.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. I was going to ask you about, so I was reading this book called Discover Your Dharma by Sahara Rose, and she points out there are 9 archetypes to how people embody their life purpose. They're nurturers, teachers, artists, warriors, activists, entertainers, artists, entrepreneurs, researchers, and visionaries. And I thought that, you seem like a very strong visionary person. And I would say that would be your archetype. I don't know if you agree or not. So I was wondering, like, as a visionary type, how did you first step into embodying that? And when faced with reality, like, as you said, like the financial constraints and the market not taking off, and how you propel yourself moving forward by just like taking the pain, what kind of insights can you share about that? Because I think being a visionary is the most ambiguous archetypes to embody compared to the other more obvious ones. So I just want
humility is going to forbid me from fully embracing the title of visionary. I'm not familiar with the typology system that you're referring to, but I will say there are characteristics I think that I possess for whatever reason. I don't feel like I can, take credit or congratulate myself for them, but sure. Yeah. I think there's maybe a disposition. I don't know why I'm disposed that way. Maybe I take after my mother a lot, and she would just drive to get done whatever she wanted to get done, including, being a single mother with 2 children to take care of. So I had a good example in my mother. So I had a fun realization that throughout the process of being an entrepreneur, if you had asked me before I got started on Oscillations about, what it was like to kind of hold up some sort of business icon, like how Steve Jobs has a sort of cult of personality, or a sort of there's like a worship culture around the iconography of Steve Jobs. The eyes would have rolled back in my head so hard. But then a couple of years into entrepreneurism, I had this kind of funny realization that something that actually did pull me through a few times was thinking about these people in history who have done really crazy things. And something that really helped me to, I guess, embrace this sort of difficult disposition and constitution was to think about these other people with whom I feel some sort of kinship across time. So one of them, of course, is Sergei Diaghilev, the founder of the Ballet Russe. You hear I've read a lot about him and the history of the company, and there's just in many ways, he was on the one hand very tender and emotional and nurturing, and then on the other hand, sometimes a difficult personality. I have been known to be unyielding and uncompromising and sort of driving. It's comforting to know that there's a place for that we can sort of accept some of our foibles and even turn them into strengths. Another character is Walt Disney. I've learned a lot about Disney. I've seen a few documentaries. I don't know as much about him as Sergei Diaghilev, but what I do know is that at the beginning of Disney, animation was little black and white animals beating each other up with giant mallets and hammers. And these were like little shorts that you saw before the main feature film. And that was all that animation aspired to be as an art form. And then all of a sudden you have this guy who heard no for 10 years, who was creating these characters to do more. And he was thinking about, he brought sound into animation for the first time. I think that was Steamboat Willie. He brought these beautiful, if you look at the first few Disney films like Bambi and Snow White and Dumbo, the things that he did for animation, like the first underwater scene and making everything look realistic and illustrating the blades of grass, and all of that was a quantum leap from where animation was before. And I think virtual reality needs that kind of injection. It needs some people to come along and try something absolutely enormous and crazy and expensive. And, Snow White went 2 years over its deadline and well over its budget. It almost killed the company. The workers were striking because of how hard it was. And then it just changed animation forever. And that example of somebody who heard no for 10 years and wanted to turn animation into something that nobody else could imagine until they saw it for themselves. That's a really inspiring story. Fantasia is my favorite because it's a little bit more abstract. It's a little bit weirder. And Disney clearly had high aspirations for animation. He brought in, I think, Hubble to the Edwin Hubble, the telescope. He brought in, I believe, Igor Stravinsky, who actually was the big composer for the Ballet Russe. He's buried next to Sergei Diaghilev in Italy. So there's a nice continuity between the Ballet Russe and the Walt Disney Company. But Disney clearly saw this great potential in animation that nobody else saw, and he continued to push the boundaries. And Fantasia actually marked the point at which he sort of stepped away from the company because the market sort of was very divided on Fantasia. Some people loved it, some people hated it, and he sort of gave up on pushing the envelope any further and sort of focused on his family and building the theme parks and things like that later on. But Fantasia I see as sort of the height of his hubris. And in that sense, I love it. And I want to see that kind of pushing in virtual reality. And so I've got these two examples from history that I can look at and say, okay, people have had big, crazy ideas before, and they pushed and pushed and pushed until it changed the world. And maybe my idea isn't meant to be, maybe it's not meant to come to fruition in that way, but I don't know the future. And so I'd like to die trying, On that note, Nintendo is another good example. I don't know anything about the history of Nintendo, but if you look at their lineup, what they did for video games, their ideas are really weird, and their intellectual property, like two plumbers that go down a drain and fight an evil kingdom of turtles to liberate the princess of the mushroom people. That's really weird. I would have loved to have been in the pitch room for that pitch. But, Zelda, Metroid, all of their intellectual property is very weird. And I love that. I love that you can build this huge company that defines culture and defines a creative medium for the next half a century by believing in your weird thing.
Yeah, wow, that's such a great insight for visionaries to know of other successful visionary role models and use them as inspiration to keep on doing it and change the world that way. That's such a great insight. Thank you for sharing that. I want to ask you, where would you say you're at on your journey towards your purpose? Have you found it? Are you working towards it? Are you living it? And what would you say your purpose is?
Yeah, I'm definitely living it. I don't think I've fulfilled it. Although in a sense, if I spend my whole life trying and it doesn't work out the way that I envision it, I still think maybe that's a kind of fulfillment in trying. I think your question kind of is sort of, it calls back some of the things that we discussed earlier. My purpose is to be a good vehicle for an idea. And I don't know if I'm ever going to have an idea as good as Oscillations. I don't want to risk it. I don't like this idea that comes out of the entrepreneurial community, which is like pivoting. If your crazy idea doesn't work, then just change it until it makes money. No, I want to keep pushing on it until it changes the world and has an impact and realizes its full potential. I don't want to turn it into a delivery service or, a social media platform where people argue all day. So yeah, I'm not the pivot kind of guy. Like for me, the idea of Oscillations is probably the best idea I'm ever going to have. It's the coalescing of everything I've ever cared about from my childhood through my adulthood. It is the vehicle through which my co-founder and I process the world and what we want. It's the gift that we want to give to humanity. And I just don't see myself turning away from it or doing anything else. So there's a neat idea from cognitive science, from researchers who are trying to understand creativity. And they want to know where the aha moment comes from. And the working theory is called opportunistic assimilation. And it's this idea that everybody has all of these inputs that they've received across the course of their life, through the course of their life. And your brain, when it's really fixated on solving a problem, or it's just maybe left to itself to kind of process these inputs, all this data that you've accumulated from a life of experience, it will sort of kind of, it'll be tossing around these ideas and doing different kind of combinatorics. Now, this is very anthropomorphic. So this isn't, don't think about the homunculus in the brain as if there's like a little me in my brain kind of toying with things. But in some sense, your neural networks are batting around these different combinations of ideas. And once there's some sort of somewhat fully baked, maybe half-baked thing, it'll sort of thrust it into your conscious awareness. So, and that's the aha moment. That's why you hear people talk about insight. Paul McCartney wakes up and writes yesterday on his bedside on a napkin or whatever. You hear artists all talk about that flash of insight, that lightning bolt. Where does that come from? And the working theory is that your subconscious is sort of processing all these things that you care about and that you think about and that you've been exposed to, and then kind of offers a solution to your consciousness. To me, Oscillations is the solution to my purpose, to my identity, and also to all of the values that Oscillations as a company stands for. If we can accomplish all of these things, it's going to be because this idea works as a package. It's got this entrepreneurial aspect to it, but it's got an arts company aspect to it. It's got a political mission and a scientific mission. And all of these things work together, kind of like Total Art, to support each other.
So it sounds like you were kind of thinking about your purpose, but then all of a sudden one day you had this idea for Oscillations, and then and you had this light bulb moment about, this is my purpose. Or was it more gradual that looking back you realized, this is my purpose?
That's interesting. Yeah, I would turn to the metaphor again of opportunistic assimilation. I think I was working in the circus. I was training like 8 to 10 hours a day to be a great performer. I didn't have like the background of being in gymnastics as a kid, so I had a lot of catching up to do. So I was very kind of focused on the circus, but also I'm a big reader. I like to read a lot of books. I read what I'm curious on. If there's a topic I really want to have an opinion about, I'll go get 20 books on the subject, and I'll try to get as many sides to a debate or a discussion or an idea as possible. And so I guess I just like to wash my brain in information. And in that sense, I think I wasn't really looking for my purpose, but I would say I didn't have one until Oscillations. Given that happened in my mid-20s, you could say I'm a late bloomer. I was still exploring and experimenting. I never really wanted to be in Cirque du Soleil or be a big performing artist, but I was really enthralled in the process and learning how to turn my body into a machine and use it to execute artistic ideas that popped into my head. That was all really interesting to me. I'm in my mid-20s, but I'm not working on my career. I'm very millennial in that sense. And sometimes I was adrift. And then all of a sudden, a lifetime of reading and the accident of being in the circus arts and seeing all my friends build brands around their talent on social media, all of a sudden, all of these preconditions are there. And all it took was somebody to say, oh, you're an artist and you're mulling around the idea of making a company. Have you thought about virtual reality? And then all of a sudden, I'm going to trade shows. I'm learning everything I can about these new technologies. I'm having conversations with neuroscientists. And then, damn, like virtual reality needs to solve its adoption problem. Creators are going to outgrow social media. It's increasingly becoming sort of like this toxic time waste and battlefield of everyone yelling at each other. The world needs more hope and inspiration. There's so much investment money with nowhere to go that it's going into these really stupid ideas like, Uber for dog kind of silly things that aren't really having an impact on the world. There's so many things, so many problems that I felt like Oscillations was this weird solution to so many things. It was like a constellation. And the real task that we are focused on now is, how do you explain a constellation that's so complex, that relates to neuroscience and the performing arts and history and entrepreneurs, when really everyone you talk to is really only one or two of those things. And your constellation is like six things, and you're sure that you see an animal. You're sure that you see a shape there. There's a there. But it's sort of one of those things where somebody has to take a chance on you. Somebody has to take a risk. It's because in some sense, it's not going to be clear until people see it for themselves. It's going to be sort of like that Disney thing. It's going to be a lot of like skepticism and no until it's created. So communicating the constellation in the sky that you see that nobody else sees is a big time sink for us. We have a little dog and pony show it's kind of silly, but that's the entrepreneurial space, is sort of learning how to communicate yourself. I think that's really the art of entrepreneurism, is how do you communicate your crazy idea? And our idea just happens to be crazier than most ideas.
Yeah. So thinking back to the time when you were adrift, not knowing what your purpose is, to today, the Brendon who is living your purpose, how are the two Brendons different?
Wow. Gosh, I would say there's a great Picasso quote. I think it's Picasso. He said, like, the idea is the least impressive part. The artist shows up and does the work. I've terribly misquoted, but the general idea is there, that like the real art is showing up and doing the work. And so once you have the idea, that's the first step. There's this nice kind of Alan Watts-esque adage about like enlightened on Tuesday, carry the water on Wednesday, or something like that. And it's this idea that like, oh, great, you're inspired, you're enlightened, you have a new idea, you have a new sense of self. What are you going to do about it? So I'd say what has changed the most is that prior to having a purpose, I had all of this input and learning and experimentation and exploring. Once I found the thing I wanted to do, it's time to get to work. It's time to refine everything. And my life has been, over the last 3 years or so, a refinement period, learning to speak entrepreneur, even though that's not natural. That's a community that, it's a lot of business school guys, tech bros, and people. I can't talk football with, some venture capitalist over a craft beer. I can't do any of those things. So how do I communicate with people that are not like me? How do I tell my story? How do I sit through marketing reports and industry trend reports? That is not my favorite thing to do, but I have to be really good at it. And that, I imagine, is like any artist, you have to learn your craft or you're not going to be very good at it. If you're a musician, you need to learn to play your instrument, and that takes hours and hours and hours of practicing scales and modes and arpeggios and other things like that. And that's not fun to do necessarily, but you have to do it. That's the biggest thing, I think, is once you find your purpose, then it's like, okay, what do I have to do? And then you have to do a lot of things you don't want to spend your time doing. The fun part is over. You had your idea. Now you have to bring that idea into the world. And that takes practice and hard work and resilience and pain tolerance.
Yeah. I want to ask about that. So for those who kind of have their idea, but they're too like scared to step out of their comfort zone and take action towards that idea, what advice do you have for them to step into it and just go for it?
Yeah. I'm tempted to be a little puckish or contrarian here and say the first thing I would do is not necessarily tell them to go for it. I would ask them to think about their responsibilities to other people. So one thing that we didn't really touch on here is that for years, it really wasn't until COVID refocused my attention on relationships that a lot of things suffered in my kind of singular devotion. So, pursuit of fun activities, keeping up with my friendships, and a lot of my responsibilities sort of fell to the wayside. I used to be someone very interested in maintaining a strong network of friends, and I did the best I could, but those things certainly suffered. And so I would ask someone like, what's it going to take to do what you do, what you want to do, what you've discovered you want to do, and what are the costs? How is this going to affect the people around you that you care about? How is it going to affect the people that care about you? Do you have responsibilities to children, to a career that depends on you and only your particular talents or knowledge of the institution where you work? How is this change going to affect those things? Just think about it and then go for it. But I would say probably, I can't say this with any certainty at all. I'm just pulling this out of the air. But the tendency maybe when you're hit with that bolt of inspiration, or at least this was the case for me, is to just go for it without thinking about any of those things. I would just say, give it some thought before you dive in. And so that every step along the way, you're being conscious of maintaining your friendships and, your family ties or your responsibilities to other people, to your community. I don't know if there's a perfect balance. I would almost guess not, but it's important to know that going in. Like, you might be living a pretty unbalanced life for a while. Going from acrobatics to entrepreneur was hard on my body. I went from 8 to 10 hours a day of training, flexibility, strength, cardiovascular stuff. I felt like a superhero. There wasn't anything I couldn't command my body to do. I felt strong. I felt invincible. 3 years of entrepreneurism and moving into my 30s, and I feel like an old man. Like, all my joints hurt, and it wasn't until I found a little balance over COVID. Actually, COVID had some silver linings for me. I was able to build a physical practice up again. I was able to get on video calls with my friends all around the world and sort of check in on those relationships, even apologize for neglect if I had to. That's not necessarily a good thing, that it took a global pandemic to get me to refocus on some things that I had neglected. So maybe it might not be the most inspiring advice. I'm sure you've talked to other people who have much more inspiring things to say than I did. But I guess I just feel compelled to bring attention to that, because I think you'll have a much more successful go of it, and you'll have a better support network as you try to do the impossible thing, if you keep that in mind.
Yeah, no, that's very important, to be mindful of your community, the people around you.
Or even your body. A lot of entrepreneurs, become like fast food computer people, and that you don't want to do that.
Right. Yeah. So I would like to go to a lightning round now. So I'm going to ask you a bunch of short rapid fire questions, and you can just answer what the first thing that comes into your mind. Okay? You ready?
Sure.
What is one thing you like to do to relax?
Baths. I take baths. I bring books into the bath. I love the running water. I still do work out a lot. I went from 8 hours a day to maybe 2.5, 3 hours a day, but I still get sore. I love Epsom salts baths. So I like reading. The running water, it's like my own little kingdom. I can't hear anything outside the bathroom door because the water's running, and I can get absorbed in a book and I can ease my muscles.
What's one thing you like to do for fun?
Fun. Gosh, what is fun again? I'm an entrepreneur. I do like doing physical things outdoors. I like skiing, cross-country skiing. I don't get the chance to do it as much in California, but hikes, anything outside. I love the smells of the natural world. So it's definitely something I like to do for fun.
What's one thing that makes you enthusiastic?
Knowledge, acquiring new knowledge. I get so excited about, I'm a bit of a bibliophile. So if I discover a new thing I want to learn about, and then I discover that there's a really good book about it or something. Yeah. Ideas, knowledge.
Yeah. What's one book that changed your life?
Wow. There's a utopian, it's sort of like anarcho-socialist arts and crafts utopian novel from the sort of pre-Raphaelite England by William Morris. It's called News from Nowhere. And it was a response actually to an American socialist utopian novel by Edward Bellamy called Looking Backwards. And it's this William Morris, the guy who does all the wallpaper designs, and beautiful, they call him the grandfather of the arts and crafts movement. And he wrote a utopian novel. He's not a great writer, but he imagined this beautiful future that humans could achieve in which the average person was, fulfilled and creative. And I read that when I was like 15 or something. And it had never occurred to me that we could totally reimagine the world. That was the first time I realized that there had been people in history who completely reimagined how we create society and how we live our lives.
Sounds interesting. I'll have to check it out. What's the most important lesson you've ever learned? What's the first thing that pops into your mind?
I grew up in an artsy family, and I had to learn the hard way as an adult that you have to play the game a little bit. So not everything is going to feel good. Not everything's going to be fun and creative. And you can't live in that sort of artsy-fartsy fantasy world all the time unless you happen to have some sort of wealthy benefactor like Isadora Duncan did, or, any number of artists who find some wealthy businessman or woman to patronize them. Yeah, you've got to, sometimes you have to toughen up and play the more kind of apish game that humans play. It's unfortunate. That's a devastating thing for an artist to learn.
Yeah, learning how to conform to the rules of society.
Ugh.
What is one habit you always do?
Habit. I'm a compulsive putter-awayer of things, and sometimes that means I actually help people to lose things. They knew they put it there and they knew where it was, and then I put it away and then forgot that I put it away because it's just a compulsive habit. Were you looking for a good habit or a foible? Sorry.
Either one, whatever.
Okay. Well, yeah.
What is one habit you're working on?
I have been playing classical guitar on and off since I was 14 or 15.
If you're not doing what you are doing today, what would you be doing?
Handstands. I say that half jokingly, but I might still be doing the circus.
Okay, cool. How would you describe your ideal life?
Oh boy. Oof. This is the fire round. Gosh, how to put that? Oh boy. I suppose just a life where I fulfill my purpose. If Oscillations becomes everything I want it to be, that will be my ideal life, whatever that looks like.
Great. And how do you define purpose?
Broadly speaking or personally?
What's the first thing that pops into your mind?
How do I define purpose? Wow. I'll answer personally because I can't think of an operationalization that would apply to all cases. Personally speaking, purpose is the opportunistic assimilation of all of the valuable inputs and insights from my life up to this point, and kind of directed at a project that to quote the Bernard Shaw quote, a project that I deem to be a mighty one. It's a great quote. You should look up George Bernard Shaw's A Splendid Torch. It is just a beautiful quote.
All right. I will do that later. And lastly, do you have any requests you would like our listeners to do?
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. So this is self-promotional, but I suppose if your curiosity is piqued, I would say the thing that can help bring oscillations into existence, and something that we can all just develop as a civic practice, as an ethical practice with a civic orientation, is to learn how to vote what we want to see in the world into the world with our attention. So if you do not actively curate your content that you're exposed to on social media will do it for you, and it will pick the things that are the most upsetting, the most polarizing, the most sort of sensational, fleeting, like white bread, very low in calories, very low in nutrition, upvote with your attention on purpose. Don't just open your social media apps and scroll. Think about, the tools are there for you to curate. I want to see this. I don't want to see this. Unsubscribe to all those things you subscribed to 15 years ago in college or whatever that are just silly and wasting your time. Think about the world you want to live in and then vote for that with your attention. And I really hope that Oscillations is one of those things that you want to vote for. We're on all the social media platforms. I'd be particularly flattered if you found us on Vero, which is a social media app that doesn't use any algorithms. I would love to see that take off as a response to the kind of ways that current social media platforms are not being very responsible with our mental health and attention.
All right, great. Now I'll put the links to Oscillation Art in the show notes. Thank you so much, Brendon, for sharing all of your knowledge and what you're doing with Oscillation Arts. It's very fascinating, and I encourage people to check it out. Thank you.
Thank you. Great questions. You're a great interview. This was delightful.
Great. I hope you've enjoyed this episode with Brendon Lewis and take away from this episode to be more mindful of what sort of art and content you're consuming on a daily basis, as they'll determine what we'll see more of in the future. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to support this podcast, please subscribe, tell your friends about it, and rate it 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. Please also follow A Working Purpose on Instagram and join our group on Facebook. May your present moment, now and forever, be filled with light, love, and joy. Until next time, this is Wing, and you are listening to A Work in Purpose.